In our lectionary reading, one of our Old Testament texts recently came from Genesis that deals with the biblical story of Abraham killing or being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac to God. And it was one of the lectionary readings that was in the Old Testament recently. And what's interesting is that text tends to really get people upset. It's this dynamic of how can God ask Abraham to sacrifice his only son after having all these promises. And we know from the story that ultimately Isaac is not sacrificed, but instead a ram is sacrificed instead. I think it's important for folks to realize, for me, the interpretation of that biblical story is not so much this kind of personal dynamic of Abraham willing to put his son Isaac up for sacrifice, which has lots of sermon material there to create lots of good sermons from. I would argue that it is really a story about the evolutionary thought process that the children of Israel had in relation to human sacrifice. The reality is that during the time of Abraham, most cultures were doing human sacrifice. They felt like the deities required human sacrifice in order to please them. So for me, the story shows that moment of revelation that Abraham said, wait a minute, human sacrifice is not necessary to please God. But instead, they moved to animal sacrifice. Now, I'm pleased that the Christian faith has moved us from animal sacrifice to the fact that Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross, that we no longer have to do an animal sacrifice either. So moving from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice, and then in the Christian faith, moving from animal sacrifice to actually the sacrifice of the deity itself, that actually the deity is sacrificed on the cross, really moves us in not just theological frameworks, but also moves us sociologically, in the sense that we are no longer sacrificing other humans, we're no longer sacrificing innocent animals, but instead we realize that the self-sacrifice that we find on the cross is what ultimately we is the universal perspective that we as a globe now embrace. We're not all Christian, but at least now people are not out there sacrificing humans and animals the way they once were. So as we turn to Easter, one of the things we need to realize is how significant that is religiously, that we as Christians worship a God that sacrificed God's self, that it was actually the deity doing the sacrifice instead of requiring animals or humans to do it for them. If you enjoyed today's message, I hope that you'll consider financially supporting the efforts that we're trying to do online. As you can imagine, like lots of churches, we've shifted from being in person to online, and yet expenses continue. And so if any way that you can help with us generously, very much appreciate you contributing to our efforts.